The sun over planet Verdun burned harsh and red. The wind was dry, carrying dust and the smell of old metal. Paul walked across the dead land, his boots crunching over rusted wires and broken parts. He had a small scanner in his hand, searching for anything left behind after the war. The scanner beeped slowly, picking up weak signals underground. He was alone. That was how he liked it. Verta-9 had been quiet for many years, long ago. Humans and alien forces had fought over this place. Now, all that was left were wrecks, bones, and silence. Paul had survived that war. Barely. Since then, he lived as a scavenger, collecting tech from the ruins and trading it for food and water. He walked for hours until the scanner beeped louder. Something was nearby. He followed the signal over a hill and saw the remains of a small craft. It was half buried in the sand, smoke still rising from its side. The metal was bent and scorched. This crash was recent. Paul pulled out his blaster and moved slowly toward the wreck. He didn't trust anything that fell from the sky. He stepped through broken pieces of the ship and opened a hatch. The door creaked and groaned. Inside, he saw her. An alien girl, no older than 20 and human. Years was lying still. Her skin was smooth and silver, with soft glowing lines running across her arms. Her eyes were closed. She wore a torn suit with strange markings. One of her legs was bleeding, and a small piece of metal was stuck in her shoulder. Paul looked around. No traps, no guards, no sound, just her. He could have walked away, left her there. It wasn't his problem. But something about the way she looked, not afraid, just weak, made him pause. Paul stepped closer. She opened her eyes. Bright blue. Not cold, just tired. She tried to speak, but her voice was too soft. Her hand lifted, trembling, as if asking for help. Paul sighed, took off his pack, and began working. He had seen injuries like this before. First, he carefully pulled out the metal. She winced but didn't scream. Then he wrapped her wounds using his old first aid kit. When he was done, she still didn't speak. She just looked at him, then reached out slowly and wrapped her arms around his neck. Not tight, just gentle, like she didn't want to let go. Paul froze. He didn't know what to say. No one had hugged him in years, not since before the war. And now this strange alien girl, with blood on her side and dust in her hair, was holding him like he was her last hope. She didn't thank him, not with words, just that silent hug. After a moment, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was light. He walked back toward his crawler, a small vehicle hidden under commo nets nearby. She didn't struggle. She didn't ask where they were going. She just laid her head on his shoulder, her arms still around his neck. Paul placed her in the crawler, gave her some water, and started the engine. As the vehicle rolled across the sands, he glanced at her. She had already fallen asleep. Great, Paul muttered. Now I've got company. Back at his shelter, an old cargo station turned into a home. Paul carried her inside. The station was made of thick walls, good for blocking heat and sandstorms. He set her on a cot and covered her with a blanket. She opened her eyes again, just for a second, and gave him a small nod. He nodded back. He had seen many things in his life. Battles, machines, fear, and fire. But this silent girl from the sky hugging his neck without saying a word felt different. Paul didn't know her name. He didn't know who she was or why her ship had fallen. But something deep inside told him that helping her was the right thing. The next day, she was still there, sleeping peacefully. And Paul, who never trusted anyone, sat nearby with his old blaster in hand, watching over her like he had something to protect again. The shelter was quiet in the morning. Sunlight came in through the small window, casting a soft glow on the girl lying on the cot. Paul sat near the door, cleaning his tools and watching the monitor for any movement outside. He had lived on this broken planet long enough to know that peace never lasted. The girl stirred. Her eyes opened slowly. She sat up with effort, her hand touching the bandage on her shoulder. Then her gaze moved to Paul. Their eyes met. She didn't smile, but she didn't look afraid either. Paul nodded at her. You're safe here, he said. She blinked and tilted her head. She didn't understand the words. Paul picked up a water bottle and handed it to her. She took it carefully, sipped once, then looked around the small room. There were tools on the wall, wires on the floor, and a soft humming sound from the power cord hidden under the floor panel. He moved to a table and placed a small plate of food there. Bread, dried fruit, and a small piece of protein bar. She came closer, sat on the edge of the cot, and ate slowly. Every few seconds, she glanced at him, watching his hands, his face, his movements. Paul pulled out a small screen and showed her a drawing he made with his finger. It was a simple sketch of a stick figure pointing at himself with the name Paul written under it. "Paul," he said, tapping the name. The girl looked at the screen. Then she pointed at him and said, "Paul." Her voice was soft, unsure. He smiled a little. Then he turned the screen to her and handed it over. She stared at it for a moment. Then she drew a small shape, something like a star with lines around it. Under it, she wrote strange symbols that Paul couldn't read. He waited. She looked at the symbols again, then erased them instead. She wrote 3 letters that looked almost human, M-I-R. Paul pointed at the letters. "Mir." She hesitated, then nodded out. He tried again. "Mira." This time, her eyes lit up. She nodded quickly and smiled. "Just a small one." "Mira," Paul said. "That's your name." She nodded once more and tapped her chest gently. "Mira." Paul leaned back and folded his arms. "All right then, Mira. You're not from around here." Mira didn't understand the words, but she knew his tone. Her face became serious. She picked up the screen again and drew a circle with a small ship falling from it. Then she drew fire and more ships behind it. Her hands moved quickly, drawing a crash, a chase, and then a lone figure helping her up. Paul watched quietly. She looked up at him. Her eyes said everything. She had been escaping. She had been hunted, and he had saved her. He reached for the screen and drew a small house. Then he drew 2 stick figures inside, one tall and one smaller. Mira saw it. She smiled again. Paul stood up and walked to his workshop. Mira followed slowly, her steps careful but steady. He showed her some of the machines he used, a welding tool, a scanner, and a small drone that no longer worked. Mira looked at each item with deep interest. She touched the scanner gently, then turned it on without pressing a button. The screen lit up. Paul raised an eyebrow. "That thing hasn't worked in weeks." Mira gave a small shrug and tapped the back of the scanner. A line of code appeared on the screen. She changed something using the scanner's panel. It beeped and gave a clear signal. "You fixed it," Paul said, surprised. Mira nodded, calm and quiet. He pointed at her, then at the device. "You know tech." Mira touched her temple with 2 fingers, as if saying she was trained. She then drew on the screen again, this time a symbol that looked like a badge or rank. She was someone important, maybe an officer or a technician, maybe more. Paul looked at her with a new understanding. "You're not just a passenger. You're someone they'll come looking for." Mira didn't react right away. Then she nodded. Slowly, she drew a new figure, tall, wearing armor, and pointed at it. Her eyes turned serious. It was a warning, Paul sighed. So someone dangerous might show up. Mira looked him in the eyes and nodded once. Paul stood in silence. He didn't ask for this. He didn't want trouble. But the moment she had hugged his neck in that wreck, something had changed. He couldn't just throw her out. "All right," he said, though she didn't understand. "You can stay here. But if they come, we have to be ready." Mira stepped closer and gently touched his arm. Then she did it again, wrapped her arms around his neck, resting her head against his shoulder. This time, it wasn't just relief. It felt like trust, like she had chosen him. Paul let out a long breath. He had lived alone for years, never letting anyone close. But now, this silent girl from another world was sleeping in his shelter, fixing his tech and hugging his neck without a single word of thanks. And somehow, he didn't mind. Days passed slowly on Vert 9. The winds never stopped, and the sky stayed pale and dry. Paul and Mira began to understand each other more, not with words, but with actions and signs. She helped him fix broken devices, clean wires, and organized tools. Paul showed her how to build traps around the shelter and taught her how to use the old blaster. Just in case. Mira watched everything with sharp eyes. She learned fast. Her hands were steady. Her mind was calm. Paul had never met anyone like her. One morning, while checking the outer fence, Paul found something strange. A trail of footprints in the sand. He crouched and touched the ground. The marks were fresh. He followed the tracks for a short distance, then stopped. The prints suddenly vanished, like someone had flown away or used a cloaking device. Paul returned to the shelter quietly. Mira was sitting on the floor, working on the scanner. She looked up when he walked in. Paul didn't speak. He just gave her a look. Mira stood up right away. She knew something was wrong. He opened a storage box and pulled out extra power cells, grenades, and tools. Mira helped him place sensors around the building. They worked without talking. She understood what needed to be done. That night, Mira couldn't sleep. She kept looking at the door. Paul sat near the window, holding his blaster, eyes on the dark. Then it happened. A soft clicking sound echoed from outside. The scanner on the wall blinked red. Movement detected. Paul signaled Mira to stay back. He moved to the door and listened. He could hear soft steps, then silence. He switched off the lights and waited. A flash of light appeared outside for 1 second, a small orb, floating and scanning. Paul had seen one before. It was a Rican drone, not human. It belonged to a group he had once fought during the war, the Vornis, a cold and ruthless species known for hunting targets without mercy. Paul raised his blaster and aimed at the orb through a small hole in the wall. One shot. The orb sparked and fell to the ground. No alarms, no noise, just silence again. Mira came beside him. Her face was pale. She had seen that drone before. She drew something on the screen, a black ship with sharp wings. Then she pointed, up, then at herself, then outside. They're close, Paul said. They're after you. Mira looked down. Her hand shook a little. Paul touched her shoulder. She looked at him. He didn't say anything, but his calm face gave her strength. The next morning, Paul walked outside to check the area. Near the broken Rican drone, he found something new, a mark scratched into the sand. It was a warning symbol. Someone had been close during the night. Someone had watched. He didn't tell Mira. He didn't want to scare her. Instead, he started preparing for a fight. He set traps along the path leading to the shelter. Old mines, pressure plates, tripwires connected to sound bombs. He even placed a motion sensor high on a rock. Mira helped. Silently, she understood the danger. That evening, she brought out a small device from her bag. It was a signal jammer, half broken, but she started fixing it. Paul watched her, impressed. You always carry stuff like that. She smiled a little and nodded. Later that night, Mira had trouble sleeping. She walked quietly to the main room and sat near the window. Paul was there, half awake. She looked tired but thoughtful. She pointed outside, then drew a small map on the dusty floor. She marked a spot not far from the shelter. A cave, safe, hidden. Paul understood her meaning. If things got worse, they had a backup plan. Paul nodded. Good idea. Suddenly, Mira stood and walked over to him. Without saying anything, she hugged his neck again. This time, her arms were tighter. Not out of fear, but something deeper. Paul didn't move right away. He just let her stay like that for a moment. Then she pulled back, sat down again, and closed her eyes. Paul stayed awake most of the night, staring out into the desert. The next morning brought something new. The scanner blinked again. This time, a strong signal. Not a drone. A full-sized ship had passed above the area just before dawn. It didn't land. It scanned and flew away. But it had seen something. Paul stood at the edge of the shelter, looking up at the sky. They're narrowing in. Mira joined him, her face serious. She held up the scanner she fixed earlier. The data showed the flight path. The ship had circled twice before leaving. They know we're here, Paul said. Mira didn't speak, but her eyes said she agreed. Paul walked back inside and started packing supplies, water, food, tools, extra gear. Mira helped. They were quiet, but focused. The plan was clear. If the enemy returned in full force, they would run to the cave. It was deep in the cliffs and hard to find as Paul loaded the crawler. He looked at Mira. She stood near the door, holding her small bag. Ready. He walked over and said, "Whatever happens, we move together." Mira gave a small nod. Then, like before, she reached out and gently hugged his neck. Paul didn't need words. Her actions were enough. Somewhere in the sky, hunters were watching. But on the ground, Paul and Mira were ready. The wind outside the shelter grew stronger with each passing hour. Dust covered the windows, and the air smelled dry and sharp. Paul checked the sensors again. The signals were clear for now, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. Mira sat near the workbench, fixing the last pieces of the signal jammer. Her fingers moved quickly, connecting wires and checking power cells. Paul glanced at her from time to time. She didn't speak, but her face showed focus. She was more than just a passenger or a survivor. There was something in her that reminded Paul of a soldier, calm under pressure, quiet, but strong. He walked over with a small container of water and handed it to her. She drank slowly, wiped her lips, and went right back to work. Paul sat beside her. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Mira looked at him. She tilted her head. Unsure of the words, Paul pointed at the jammer, then at her. "You've fixed these before. You're trained." She nodded slowly. Paul picked up a small screen and drew two simple shapes. One was a crown. The other was a wrench. Then he pointed at Mira. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she drew a circle around both symbols and tapped it. "You're both," Paul said. "A leader and an engineer." Mira nodded again. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried something heavy. She drew again. A ship. Then another ship behind it. Then fire. She showed it to Paul. "You were leading something." Then it all fell apart. Mira placed the screen down and looked away. Paul didn't ask more questions. He knew that pain. He had seen leaders fall. He had seen battles where the strongest people couldn't stop what was coming. Sometimes surviving was the only thing left. Later that afternoon, Paul and Mira walked outside to check the traps. The wind had buried some under the sand, but Mira used the scanner to find them. She made small changes to improve them, moving the wires so they wouldn't spark to early as they worked. The scanner beeped. Not a sensor trap, something else. Paul crouched and checked the screen. A figure was approaching from the east, one single life form, moving slowly. No sound, no ship in sight. He looked at Mira. She already had the blaster in her hands. They moved to cover and waited. Minutes passed. Then they saw it. A tall figure stepped out from behind a dune. It wore dark armor, smooth and sharp, with a helmet that reflected the sun. The steps were silent. The figure stopped just outside the shelter. "Range, scanning the area." Paul whispered. "One of them, a scout." Mira's hands tightened on the blaster. Paul signaled for her to stay low. The figure walked forward slowly, stepping over one of the buried traps. Click. A blast of sound and light exploded from the ground. The scout flew back and hit the sand hard. Paul jumped to his feet and aimed. The scout was fast. It rolled and fired a shot from its wrist, nearly hitting the corner of the shelter. Mira didn't wait. She moved to the side and circled behind the attacker. Paul watched as she knelt beside a power core, pressed a few buttons, and activated a shock net hidden in the ground. The scout stepped forward again. Zap. A field of electricity sparked around its legs. The figure screamed through its helmet and dropped. Paul ran forward, kicked the weapon away, and pulled off the helmet. The face beneath was pale and rough, with red eyes and sharp lines. It hissed at Paul in a language he didn't understand. Mira stepped beside him and stared down at the scout. She leaned forward, took a small device from the scout's belt, and opened it. It was a locator, flashing red, sending a signal. Paul cursed under his breath. He already called them. Mira held up the device and crushed it under her boot. Paul looked at the sky. They're coming now. This was just the start. They dragged the scout to a metal chamber and locked him inside. The shelter didn't have a jail, but the old storage vault was strong enough. Paul added extra locks and used wires to keep the door shut. Inside, the scout sat still. Glaring at them, Mira looked at him once more, then turned away. That night, Paul and Mira worked quietly. They packed extra supplies: water, power cells, medical gear. Mira also gathered two small devices she had hidden since she arrived. One looked like a beacon, the other, a translator. She gave Paul the translator and helped him connect it to his wrist. Paul activated it, the screen lit up, and a small voice spoke. Basic words, low power, use wisely. He looked at Mira, surprised. You've had this all along. She nodded. Paul spoke slowly. Why now? The translator clicked. Mira answered in a soft voice, because now we move together. Paul stared at her. It was the first time he had heard her speak through something he could understand. The words were simple, but they held weight. You could have left, he said. Mira shook her head. I stayed. You helped me. I help you. Paul felt something deep in his chest shift. He wasn't used to this. Trust, loyalty, connection. But Mira didn't ask for thanks. She didn't speak much. She just stood beside him, ready to face whatever came next. He picked up the bag and handed her one. Then we stayed ready. Mira smiled faintly. Then, as she had done before, she stepped forward and hugged his neck. No words, no promises, just quiet trust. Paul didn't move for a while. The stars outside were starting to appear, and somewhere far away, the real enemy was getting closer. The night on Verdun was quiet, but it felt heavy. The stars above blinked softly, and the wind carried a cold chill. Inside the shelter, Paul sat by the window, staring out into the desert. His blaster rested on his lap. Mira sat beside him, the small beacon device in her hands. She had been working on it for over an hour. The beacon was old and damaged, but she believed she could still send a short message, a coded signal. Not strong enough to reach many systems, but enough for someone specific. Paul looked at her. You sure this is safe? Mira nodded and turned the small dial on the side of the beacon. A faint light blinked. Then she handed him the screen connected to it. Paul read the message. It was in her language, but she translated using the wrist. Device. To my brother. I'm alive. One human saved me. I chose to stay. I ask only you to answer. No others. Paul raised an eyebrow. You trust him? Mira nodded again. Only him. She pressed a button, and the beacon blinked faster. The message was sent. Then the device powered down. Now, all they could do was wait. Hours passed. Mira sat close to the window, her eyes on the sky. Paul stayed quiet, thinking about everything that had happened. He had been alone for so long. Then she came into his life like a falling star. And now, the silence was different. It felt less empty. Suddenly, the scanner beeped. Paul stood up fast. Mira moved to the screen. A signal was approaching from above. A small ship. No weapons active. Speed low. It wasn't a warship. Paul narrowed his eyes. Is that him? Mira watched the screen. She didn't speak, but her hands tightened. The ship slowed as it entered the atmosphere. Then it disappeared from the radar. Paul grabbed his gear. Let's go. They left the shelter and climbed to the top of the nearest hill. The sky was dark, but they could see a soft blue light landing in the valley below. The ship touched the ground gently, making no sound. Paul aimed his blaster, just in case. Mira stepped forward. The door of the ship opened. A tall figure stepped out. His skin was silver like Mira's, but his hair was darker and longer. He wore light armor, and his eyes scanned the area with caution. When he saw Mira, he stepped forward quickly. Mira, he said. She ran toward him. Not fast, not panicked, calm and sure. They stood in silence for a moment. Then she placed her hand on his chest, and he did the same. It was a greeting, a sign of peace. Paul stayed back, watching. Mira turned and waved him over. Paul walked carefully. The man looked at him with a serious face. "I'm Torin," he said. His voice came through the translator Mira had fixed. Paul nodded. "Paul," Torin looked at Mira. "You sent the signal. Only me. You were clear." Mira nodded. Torin looked back at Paul. "You saved her, protected her, even fought for her." Paul said nothing. Torin stepped forward and held out a small badge. "This is a symbol of our thanks. Our people don't forget those who protect family." Paul didn't take the badge. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said. Torin looked surprised. "Then why?" Paul glanced at Mira. "Because she needed help." Mira stepped closer and gently took Paul's hand. Then she looked at Torin and spoke in her own language. The translator gave her words. "I want to stay, not leave with you." Torin stared at her. "Why?" Mira turned to Paul. "Because I trust him. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't demand answers. He gave me safety. That is more than my title ever gave me." Torin looked at both of them. He sighed and placed the badge back into his pocket. "I came to find you, not to take you back by force," he said. "But if you stay, danger will follow. The enemy wants you." "I know," Mira said. Paul stepped forward. "Then we fight. If they come." Torin gave him a slow nod. "You're ready for that." Paul smiled slightly. "I've fought worse." Torin looked up at the sky. "A bigger ship is searching. It will arrive soon. If you need help, send this." He handed Mira a small crystal device. She took it with care. "This will call me only," Torin said. "I'll come if you're in real danger." Paul and Mira nodded together. Torin walked back to his ship. Before entering, he turned around one last time. "She's stronger than you think." Paul looked at Mira. "I already know." The ship lifted and disappeared into the sky. Paul and Mira walked back to the shelter slowly. The stars above were bright, but a feeling of storm was in the air. Trouble was close. They both felt it. Inside the shelter, Paul placed the new device on a shelf. Mira sat down and opened the scanner again. She showed him a map of the planet. A large ship was now moving toward their area. It was a Vornis war vessel, big, fast, and deadly. Paul stared at the screen. "So it begins?" Mira looked at him. Her face was calm. Paul whispered, "We'll face it, together." Mira reached out and, once again, hugged his neck. And in that moment, Paul knew something had changed forever. The sky over Verdun stayed dark longer than usual. A storm was forming in the upper atmosphere, hiding stars behind thick clouds. Inside the shelter, Paul and Mira checked their gear again. They knew the calm would not last. The scanner on the wall gave off a slow, steady beep. A large object had entered orbit. It was the Vornis warship. Paul leaned over the screen. "That's a Hunter class. Heavy weapons, fast engines, full crew." Mira stood beside him, silent. She tapped the screen, zooming in on the shape. Then she marked the path. The ship was not just passing. It was scanning every section of land. Moving closer with each pass, Paul looked at her. "They want you back." Mira didn't speak. She opened her bag and took out a small chip. She placed it in the screen's side port. New data appeared. It was written in her native language. But Paul understood the images, pictures of her, details, a title, a list of ranks. Her name appeared in both human and alien letters. Mira Valen, Royal Envoy and second heir to the Kyrillin High House. Paul stared at the screen. "Your royalty." Mira nodded slowly. "You were running from them." She nodded again, then brought up another image. A man in silver armor, her father, a strict ruler. His face was cold. In the next image, Mira was shown standing before a group, refusing something. Then came pictures of ships in flames and her escape. Pod flying away. Paul sat down, his voice low. "You didn't want their plan." Mira looked at him and tapped her chest. Then she pointed at Paul. He understood. "You didn't want to be told who to be. You wanted to choose." Mira took his hand and squeezed it gently. Just then, the scanner beeped louder. Paul rushed to the screen. A smaller craft had left the warship. It was coming toward their area. Paul activated the shelter's defenses. The traps were live. The power core was set to emergency mode. Mira checked the shock net and picked up her blaster. They waited. The craft landed half a mile away. Paul watched from the hill with his binoculars. Two figures stepped out. One was Kyrillin, dressed in white. The other wore the armor of a Vorna's commander. Paul returned to the shelter. They brought a negotiator and a hunter. Mira looked out the window. She knew this moment was coming. The scanner buzzed again. A voice came through, translated into human speech. This is Commander Rel of the Vorna's force. We come to retrieve Kyrillin envoy Mira Valen. You are holding her without permission. Release her now, and no action will be taken. Paul turned to Mira. Do we answer? She shook her head and walked outside. Paul followed, keeping his blaster ready. They stood near the edge of the shelter, facing the two distant figures. A voice came again. Mira Valen, your presence is required by order of the High House. Return at once. Mira lifted the translator and pressed the speak button. I choose to stay. There was silence. Then the Vorna's commander stepped forward. You belong to your people. This human cannot protect you from what's coming. Mira raised her voice. He protected me when I was broken. He never asked who I was. He never forced me to return. He let me choose. Paul stood tall beside her. The Kyrillin envoy tried again. You are second heir. Your duty is with your family. Mira shook her head. My duty is to truth. And this is where I found it. The Vorna's commander reached for his weapon. Paul fired first. A blast hit the ground near the commander's feet. Dust flew up. The figure stepped back. Paul called out, This is your last warning. Leave, now. The Vornas looked ready to fight, but the Kyrillin envoy placed a hand on his arm. They turned and walked back to their craft. Mira and Paul returned inside. Paul locked the door and looked at her. That was bold. Mira looked tired but strong. She sat down beside him. You meant that? He asked. She nodded. I choose. This. Paul watched her closely. Even if it brings more danger. Mira leaned in. You gave me freedom. I won't give it up. Paul said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, they prepared for more attacks, but none came. By morning, the warship had left orbit. Only silence remained. Mira looked out the window, her eyes soft. Paul stood beside her. You're not going back, are you? She shook her head. No. Paul smiled. Good. Then she did it again. Stepped close, wrapped her arms around his neck, and rested her head on his shoulder. And Paul, who had lived through war, loss, and years of silence, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt peace. The sun rose slowly over Verdun. Its red light spread over the dry lands and broken ruins. Paul stood outside the shelter, watching the horizon. The planet was quiet again, but he knew that nothing stayed peaceful for long here. Mira joined him, her footsteps soft on the sandy ground. She looked at the sky and then at Paul. For the first time since she arrived, she smiled without hesitation. We can leave, she said, her voice clear and steady. Paul turned to her. Are you sure? She nodded. Yes, the warship is gone. The danger is less, and I want to see more than this broken world. Paul thought for a moment. He had lived here for years, alone with his memories and scars. Now, with Mira, things felt different. He didn't want to leave behind what was familiar, but he also didn't want to lose the chance to start over. I'll go with you, he said. Mira reached out and took his hand. They returned to the shelter to pack. Paul gathered what little he had: tools, water, food, and Mira prepared her own belongings. She showed Paul a small map with safe routes to the nearby spaceport. As they worked, a soft hum filled the air. Outside, a shuttle landed quietly near the shelter. It was Torrin's ship, Mira's brother. He stepped out, looking serious but kind. I came as promised, Torrin said, to take you home, Mira. Mira looked at Paul, then back at her brother. I have chosen a new home, she said. With Paul, Torrin nodded slowly. I understand. But know this, the High House will never forget. You carry their blood, and you carry their hope. Paul stepped forward. We will protect her. Together, Torrin smiled faintly. I believe you will. The three of them boarded the shuttle. As it lifted off, Paul looked down at Verdun, a place of silence, dust, and memories. But now, it was the place where a new story began. In the stars above, the shuttle sped toward the Chirolan homeworld. It was a planet of shining cities, deep forests, and endless skies. Mira's people waited there, but she was no longer just an envoy or a princess. She was someone who had found freedom and friendship in the most unexpected place. Paul looked at Mira. She smiled and hugged his neck again. This time, there was no need for words or thanks. Her embrace said everything together. They left the silence behind. And in the vast universe, two souls, one human, one alien, began a journey, not of war or fear, but of trust, hope, and a future they would build side by side.